Okay, in this short video, we're going to look at the process of emancipation during the American Civil War. It's important to remember that in the late spring and summer of 1861, the federal troops that march off to war are going to put down the rebellion to save the Union. They are not, the primary stated goal is to not end slavery. Lincoln himself, in his March 4th, 1861 inaugural address, is very clear on the matter. He says, "I will not touch slavery where it exists, but we will not allow it to expand into the free territories of the West." That was enough for the southern slave states, many of whom by March of 1861 had already left the Union. They did not believe Lincoln. They did not believe Northern Republicans and their insistence that they would not touch slavery where it already existed. But as the war drags on and it becomes a much longer conflict than anybody envisions, it becomes necessary on a military sense to end slavery, but also for a sort of moral imperative for many Northerners to end this institution of slavery. Now, here's just a map here as the war begins. The red states are the states that have claimed to have left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, while the blue states are the Union, the federal troops that will win the war, and then the border states there are the striped ones. Those are slave states, which for whatever reason remained within the Union, sometimes through the use of force, such as in Missouri. Now, in May of 1861, so the war has begun. Fort Sumter was in April of 1861. And in May, General Benjamin Butler has runaways arrive in his lines in Virginia. And there's no federal policy of what to do with these enslaved peoples who have stolen away with their bodies, who have ran away from their masters. And so he designates them contraband of war and refuses to send them back to rebel lines. Now, under international law, enemy property that could be used against the United States could fall under this category. Enslaved labor had been used or was already being used by the Confederates to build fortifications and other essential services, right? You have thousands of men who are leaving their farms to fight. And so enslaved labor was being used to prop up the Confederate States of America. Now, in later May, the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, orders Butler to provide a safe haven for the Black people helping the Confederate war effort and put them to work as laborers. These become what's known as contraband camps, which by the end of the war is going to house 25,000 people. And if you Google it, you can find many of these images. The federal government was not ready or prepared to house and provide for the thousands of runaway slaves that were going to flock to Union lines over the course of the war, and so they end up in these contraband camps. We're not the safest places to be with disease. They were not the most sanitary places. But again, you can go through and you can find some really good images online of what these contraband camps looked like. Now, you're also going to see developments in official law that are going to clarify the legal status of runaway slaves and start to push Union policy towards emancipation more broadly. Now, it's important to remember is while you have Northern abolitionists who are pushing Lincoln, who's a moderate, to make this war about ending slavery, a lot of this is happening because of the actions taken by enslaved peoples themselves, by stealing themselves away at night and forcing people like General Butler to figure out what is the status of these people. Now, in August of 1861, you're going to see the first Confiscation Act passed by Congress. And what this act did is it allowed Union troops to seize any private property held by Confederate citizens that was used to promote this insurrection, this rebellion by Southern states. And this included slaves directly related to the war effort. So those that the Union Army considered to be building fortifications, etc. It didn't define the legal status of these people, but it did increase the likelihood for freedom. As the war drags on into its second summer of 1862, you see the more confiscation acts. The second Confiscation Act is going to forbid the military to return slaves, calling these fugitives captives of war. It declares them, quote, forever free. And this law would go on to authorize the seizure and sale of any property from disloyal citizens, so those that supported or fought for the Confederacy. In April of 1862, Washington, D.C. is going to abolish slavery, and that had long been a goal of abolitionists. And then in June of that year, they're going to end slavery in federal territories, so territories that had not yet become states. And so remember, this is a Congress that is run by Northerners, right? Most Southerners left, had withdrawn their offices during secession. Now, as I said, there were Northerners that were pushing the issues, being the runaway slave Frederick Douglass, who ran away from slavery in 1838. And he would go on to become a nationally renowned abolitionist, speaker, and writer. He met with Lincoln during the war. He is publishing editorials, pushing the federal government, pushing the administration to make this about ending slavery. You also had newspaper editor like Horace Greeley and Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, who is also a vocal abolitionist, who are encouraging Lincoln to do more with slavery. Lincoln is still concerned about a negative reaction politically. He also has the border states to consider. He does not want to drive these slave states out of the Union by passing a broad emancipation bill. And he famously says that, my object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So in the summer of 1862, as he's writing to Horace Greeley, he is, still hanging on to this primary goal of saving the Union. That is his chief goal as the president of the United States. Now, Lincoln, although he had anti-slavery impulses, he was nominated by the Republican Party for the 1860 election because he was a moderate. Within the Republican Party, he was not considered a radical abolitionist, even though his opponents claimed him to be. He was also not somebody who necessarily believed in the equality of the races, especially not early in the war. He did believe that after the war, there might need to be some colonization or repatriation of Black Americans that would be returning them to Africa. And he wasn't sure that whites and Blacks could peaceably live together. But in 1863, you see the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this goes back to the fall of 1862. The federal armies had a victory at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland over Confederate forces. And Lincoln used that as a mandate to put forth a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And what that said in September of 1862 was that if the Confederates did not surrender in 100 days, that all slaves would be free. Of course, the Confederates did not surrender. And so here comes January 1st, 1863, and his Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. This did not end slavery as is commonly held. All this did was free a small number of slaves that were held within Union occupied territory. So, and at this point, that's not very much of the Confederacy. So, slaves in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia were not freed by this. Very few enslaved peoples actually were officially freed through this policy. Now, despite that, the enslaved peoples themselves symbolically knew that the Emancipation Proclamation meant that if this war turns out in the Union's favor, that freedom was going to follow. Now, it's important to remember that enslaved people were central to the Confederacy. Again, building fortifications, hauling equipment, serving as teamsters or drivers, serving as manservants. Many officers from the South, especially if they're wealthy, would bring their enslaved peoples along with them to serve, to take care of them. And as I mentioned, the shortage of white men running plantations and farms proved the necessity of slave labor for them in their absence, but also allowed these enslaved peoples to carve out a little bit more agency. Some lack of supervision with their masters gone. They could slow down their work, disobey orders, ignore those orders, and move a little bit more freely around. Now, in January of 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman has moved through parts of the South and basically dismantled the infrastructure of parts of Georgia and South Carolina. And along the way, he establishes Field Orders number 15, which he issues from Savannah, Georgia, in January of 1865. And this was an outcome of the fact that thousands of enslaved African Americans had basically begun following his army as they moved through the South. And so what he does is there's Field Orders number 15 designated a large area of land in South Carolina for the use of these now former slaves, resettling, allowing them to resettle that with household heads being provided with 40 acres of land and a mule. So if you hear this term 40 acres and a mule, this goes back to Sherman's Field Orders of January 1865. And there was a belief that this policy would continue forward, that after slavery, the former slaves would be given land and a mule to work it. This was land that they had worked for, their families had worked for generations, and frankly had a right to it. Now that's not going to happen. Sherman's Field Orders are going to be revoked, and most of that land is going to be returned to the very men who had waged a rebellion against the Union. Before the war even ended, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government organization that sent aid workers to the South to help both poor whites and the freedmen, as the former slaves are known now, acquire an education, to negotiate contracts, and also find shelter and jobs and things along those lines. Again, this is the South, as the war ends in May of 1865, is a devastated, occupied territory. And so the federal government is sending in aid through the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the process of emancipation becomes official, or ends rather, concludes with the 13th Amendment, which in February of 1864, Lincoln had pushed through Congress, but it still had to be ratified by the states. And that is not going to happen until the end of 1865. So even after the war ends, slavery still existed in some areas, especially in those border states. And in December of 1865, the 13th Amendment is added to the Constitution, in which it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, what's important about this is Section 2 here is that for the first time, this amendment empowers the federal government. Before, if you look at the other amendments, it had been limiting the power of the federal government. And the 13th Amendment shows this, symbolizes really this transformation in governing authority in the United States as well, brought on by the Civil War and the end of slavery.